"I'll go slow," he whispered that night, and everything changed. No one expected those words would turn their wedding night into something so beautiful. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to discover what really happened after that moment. The moon poured its silver light over the vineyards of Whitmore Estate, tinting with platinum the century-old vines that had witnessed entire generations of the Whitmore family. Charlotte Elizabeth Whitmore Harrison stood motionless before the gilded mirror in her new bedroom, observing the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. The wedding dress lay carefully folded on the burgundy velvet settee, like a silk ghost refusing to disappear completely. Her fingers trembled as she undid the intricate updo that the stylists had spent hours perfecting. Strand by strand, hair black as a raven's wing fell over her bare shoulders, freeing itself from the pearl pins that had belonged to her grandmother, her great-grandmother, to all the Whitmore women who had walked toward uncertain altars with heads held high and hearts locked away under 7 keys. 23 years old, barely 23 years of life, and she already felt like one more family relic, exhibited and sold to the highest bidder. The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway made her heart stop for an instant that seemed eternal. The carved oak door opened with an almost imperceptible whisper, and the figure of James Alexander Harrison was silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor's wall sconces. He was an imposing man, there was no doubt about that. Tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of invisible empires, with hair beginning to silver at the temples, like signals of battles fought in silence. His eyes, a brown so dark they seemed to swallow the light, observed her with an intensity Charlotte couldn't interpret. Was it desire, curiosity, or simply the cold evaluation of a businessman examining his latest acquisition? "Charlotte." His voice was deep, profound as a bottomless well. She turned completely toward him, raising her chin with the pride she'd been taught to display since the cradle. She wouldn't allow him to see her fear. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "James." The silence that followed was dense, charged with unspoken words and suffocating expectations. He advanced 2 steps toward her, and Charlotte had to resort to all her upbringing not to retreat. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something citrus she couldn't identify, invaded her senses like a warning. Then, something happened that she never would have anticipated. James stopped half a meter away, and his impenetrable expression softened in an almost imperceptible way. His eyes, which moments before had seemed made of stone, acquired a different gleam, something that dangerously resembled tenderness. "I'll take it slow," he whispered, and his voice broke slightly on the last syllable, revealing a vulnerability that contradicted everything Charlotte believed she knew about this man. Those 3 words, pronounced with unexpected delicacy, pierced Charlotte's defenses like a ray of sun-piercing storm clouds. She felt something inside her break and reconstruct simultaneously, like an ancient vase finding a new form after shattering. He extended his hand toward her, not to take hers but as an invitation, a silent question awaiting an answer that only she could give. Charlotte observed him carefully for the first time since they'd exchanged words at that engagement party 3 months ago, when their families had sealed the agreement that would unite them. She noticed the deep circles under his eyes, the small worry lines on his forehead, the almost imperceptible way his right hand unconsciously sought the antique ring he wore on his pinky finger. He had suffered, she understood in that instant. This man who commanded financial empires with an iron fist, who made magnates and bankers tremble with a single glance, had known pain in a way that had transformed him profoundly. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he added, slowly lowering his hand when she didn't respond immediately. "I know this isn't what either of us would have chosen, but I'm willing to try, if you are too." Charlotte felt tears threatening to escape her eyes, but held them back with years of practiced emotional discipline. She had expected coldness, demands, perhaps even cruelty. She hadn't expected kindness. "Why?" she asked, and her voice sounded more fragile than she would have wished. "Why do you care what I feel?" James looked at her for a long moment before responding. In his eyes danced shadows of stories she didn't yet know, ghosts of a past he guarded jealously. "Because once I forgot that people aren't transactions," he said finally, "and that forgetting cost me everything I loved." He turned and walked toward the door, stopping at the threshold with one hand resting on the carved frame. "Rest, Charlotte. Tomorrow will be a long day, and we have a whole life to get to know each other." The door closed behind him gently, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the persistent scent of his cologne. Charlotte sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling that the world she thought she knew had transformed into something completely new in the space of a few minutes. Outside, the night wind swayed the century-old vines, and somewhere in the mansion, the distant sound of a cello rose toward the stars like a silent prayer. That night, Charlotte Elizabeth Whitmore Harrison, now Charlotte Harrison, understood that arranged marriages could contain seeds of something unexpected, something that dangerously resembled hope. The first week as James Harrison's wife was like inhabiting a strange dream, where each room held secrets that whispered from the shadows. The mansion was immense, a structure of stone and memory that rose on a hill overlooking miles of vineyards, orchards, and fields that at this time of year remained dormant, awaiting spring. It had been built by James's grandfather, a man who, according to the portraits in the vestibule, had possessed the same intense gaze as his grandson, but with a trace of joy that Charlotte didn't find in her husband's eyes. Each morning, when she woke with the first rays of California sun filtering through the lace curtains, the bed beside her was already empty and cold. James left before dawn toward San Francisco, where the central offices of his business empire were located. He invariably returned after she had retired to her room, leaving behind only the murmur of his footsteps in the hallway and the persistent scent of his cologne. Charlotte wandered through the mansion like an apparition, dressed in silk, discovering room after room a museum dedicated to solitude. There were salons with very high ceilings, where furniture remained covered by white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. There was a library that occupied an entire wing of the house, with shelves rising until they were lost in the gloom of the vaulted ceiling, but where dust on the spines of books revealed years of abandonment. There was a glass conservatory where plants had died long ago, leaving only skeletal remains that reached toward the light like pleading hands. And there were portraits, dozens of portraits covered by white cloths, hiding faces that Charlotte sensed belonged to stories no one wanted to remember. "The master ordered them covered 5 years ago," explained Margaret, the housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman with wise eyes and hands that had cared for this house for decades. "It was right after, well, after what happened." "What happened?" asked Charlotte, but Margaret simply shook her head and murmured something about pots on the stove. The first days Charlotte found small gestures of consideration that deeply puzzled her. A cup of chamomile tea appeared on her nightstand each evening, prepared exactly as she liked it, with a teaspoon of honey. New books appeared in the library, always of the genre she preferred: classic romantic novels, American poetry from the 19th century, treatises on art history. Fresh flowers adorned her room each morning, bouquets of jasmine and lilies that perfumed the air with fragrances that seemed specifically chosen for her. But of James himself, almost nothing. The notes she found on the breakfast table were polite, almost formal in their brevity. "I hope you slept well. If you need anything, Margaret has instructions to fulfill any request. I'll be back late. Jay." "The gardens are beautiful this time of year. Perhaps you'd like to walk through them. I've ordered the gazebo by the fountain prepared for tea time. Jay." "If you wish to visit San Francisco, the driver is at your disposal. There's a Sargent exhibition at the Legion of Honor Museum I thought might interest you. Jay." Charlotte read those notes with a mixture of frustration and fascination. What kind of man was capable of remembering her tastes in tea and literature, but incapable of sustaining a conversation of more than 3 sentences during dinner? Dinners were the only time of day they coincided, and they unfolded in a silence so dense Charlotte could almost touch it. Seated at opposite ends of a mahogany table designed for 20 diners, they exchanged empty courtesies while servants served dishes she barely tasted. "How was your day?" he would ask, and his tone suggested the question was more ritual than genuine interest. "Quiet. The garden is lovely," she would respond, and her words fell into the void like stones into a bottomless well. "I'm glad," he would say, and return to concentrating on his plate, on his thoughts, on that interior world to which she had no access. The internal conflict consuming Charlotte was devastating in its complexity. Part of her despised this situation, the idea of having been exchanged like a piece on a family chessboard. She hated the sensation of being a porcelain doll exhibited in a luxurious display case, admired but never truly touched. She had been educated to be the perfect wife, to smile at appropriate moments, to keep silent when convenient, to ornament a man's life without demanding anything in return. But no one had taught her to be loved, and that lack pulsed within her like an open wound. However, another part of Charlotte, a part that grew with each passing day, began to feel a dangerous curiosity toward the enigma that was James Harrison. She observed his hands when they dined together, noticing how soft they were for someone who had built an empire from nothing. She noticed the involuntary gesture of touching the antique ring on his pinky, a tic he repeated dozens of times a day, without seeming conscious of it. She noticed the way his eyes darkened when he believed no one was watching, revealing an ocean of sadness that contradicted his facade of implacable businessman. She wanted to hate him for his coldness, but she couldn't ignore the small gestures of consideration that revealed a heart that, though hidden, continued to beat. "Ma'am," Margaret's voice pulled her from her thoughts one afternoon, while Charlotte absently leafed through a book in the library. "There's something you might want to see." The housekeeper led her through hallways she hadn't yet explored to an oak door that remained locked. Margaret opened it with one of the many keys hanging from her belt, revealing a study that had clearly been frequently used until not long ago. There was a desk covered with yellowed papers, an antique record player next to a collection of classical music vinyl, and in a corner, leaning against the wall like a fallen soldier, a cello covered in dust. "It belonged to Miss Rebecca," said Margaret, and her voice was tinged with a sadness Charlotte didn't fully understand. "She played for the master every evening, until she stopped playing." "Who was Rebecca?" asked Charlotte, though she already suspected the answer. But Margaret simply shook her head and left the study, leaving her alone with the relics of a story she didn't yet know. Charlotte ran her fingers over the cello's strings, drawing out a discordant note that resonated in the room like a lament. Whoever Rebecca was, she had left her mark in every corner of this mansion. In the covered portraits, in James's silence, in the ring he never stopped touching. And for the first time since her arrival, Charlotte felt something that dangerously resembled jealousy. On the fourth day of her second week as a wife, Charlotte finally gathered the courage to cross a line she sensed was dangerous. Dinner proceeded with the usual monotony. James chewed his salmon with his gaze lost at some indefinite point on the lace tablecloth, while she pushed her risotto around without bringing a single bite to her mouth. The silence was so thick that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the vestibule seemed to thunder like distant storms. Charlotte had spent days observing, analyzing, attempting to decipher the enigma that was her husband. She had noticed patterns in his behavior, silent rituals he repeated without apparent awareness. The first was the gesture of touching the ring, that involuntary movement that arose especially when he was nervous or pensive. The second was the way his eyes drifted toward the window facing the California garden, as if searching for something or someone who was no longer there. The third was how he avoided passing through certain hallways, making unnecessary detours to avoid crossing in front of certain doors. That night, driven by a courage bordering on recklessness, Charlotte let her fork fall onto the plate with a deliberate sound. "James," her voice broke the silence like a stone shattering the surface of a tranquil pond, "may I ask you a question?" He raised his gaze, and for an instant Charlotte saw a flash of surprise in his dark eyes. It was perhaps the first time she had initiated a conversation during dinner. "Of course," he responded, setting his silverware on the plate with almost military precision. Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling her heart accelerate its rhythm. "The ring you wear on your pinky," she said, gesturing subtly with her head. "It's not a man's ring, it's small, delicate. Whose was it?" The change was instantaneous and brutal. James's face, already pale by nature, turned white as the marble of the garden statues. His jaw tensed visibly, and the muscle in his cheek trembled with an involuntary spasm. The fork he had set on the plate fell to the floor with a metallic clatter that echoed in the dining room like a gunshot. For a few seconds that seemed eternal. He simply looked at her, His eyes, usually impenetrable, shone with something Charlotte couldn't identify. Was it pain, rage, or simply the echo of a wound that had never healed? Without uttering a single word, James rose from the table. His chair scraped the tiled floor with an unpleasant screech. With rigid, almost robotic movements, he walked toward the dining room door. "James!" Charlotte called, but he didn't stop. The door closed behind him with a sharp blow, and she remained alone in the vast dining room, surrounded by half-eaten plates and the deafening silence of unanswered questions. She had crossed an invisible line. That was evident. But instead of fear or regret, Charlotte felt something completely different. Victory. She had found a crack in her husband's impenetrable armor. She had touched a nerve he believed protected by layers upon layers of calculated indifference. The question now was, what would she do with that knowledge? The following 3 days, James disappeared completely. He left no notes on the breakfast table. He didn't appear for dinner. Margaret murmured that he had locked himself in his San Francisco office, that he hadn't returned to the mansion a single night. Charlotte wandered through the house with an unease she couldn't quell. She felt guilty for having provoked that reaction, but also intrigued by the intensity of the response. Who was the woman who owned that ring? And why did James continue wearing it after so many years? The third night of her husband's absence, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She got out of bed, wrapped herself in a silk shawl, and went down to the kitchen looking for a glass of warm milk. That's when she heard it. A sound floating in the early morning air, so unexpected that at first she believed it was a product of her imagination. It was music. A cello playing a classical melody charged with such profound sadness, it made her chest ache. Charlotte followed the sound like a moth drawn to a flame, traversing shadowy hallways until reaching the courtyard that constituted the heart of the mansion. The Moorish fountain in the center, with its intricate design of tiles in blue and golden tones, gleamed under the light of the full moon. And beside it, seated on a stone bench, was James. But this wasn't the James she knew. This man played the cello with his eyes closed, and silent tears rolled down his cheeks without him making the slightest attempt to hide them. His posture, usually rigid and controlled, had completely collapsed. He played with heartbreaking passion, drawing from the instrument notes that seemed like moans, laments, pleas to a sky that didn't respond. Charlotte remained paralyzed in the shadows of the archway giving access to the courtyard, not daring to breathe for fear of breaking that moment of extreme vulnerability. She had never seen anyone play with such emotion. It was as if James poured into each note all the pain his stone face refused to express during the day. The melody reached its climax, a series of heartbreaking arpeggios that made Charlotte feel a lump in her throat. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the music ceased. James lowered the cello and rested it on his knees, breathing raggedly. His shoulders trembled with silent sobs he tried to control without success. It was at that moment he raised his gaze and saw her. Their eyes met across the distance of the courtyard, illuminated only by the silver light of the moon reflecting in the fountain. Charlotte expected him to become angry, to accuse her of spying, to raise again the wall she had managed to demolish momentarily. But he did none of that. Instead, James simply looked at her. He didn't try to dry his tears. He didn't try to hide his vulnerability. For the first time since they'd known each other, he showed her his true face, that of a broken man who had forgotten how to ask for help. "It was Rebecca," he said finally, and his voice sounded hoarse, torn. "The ring. It was hers." Charlotte advanced slowly toward him, as if approaching a wounded animal. She sat beside him on the stone bench, leaving enough space not to overwhelm him, but close enough for him to know he wasn't alone. "Who was Rebecca?" she asked softly. James closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to speak. She was everything. And then, under the starry California sky, with the murmur of the fountain as their only company, he began to tell her the story he had kept for 5 long years of solitude. Rebecca's story came from James's lips in fragments, like a broken mirror whose pieces are found one by one over the days. That first night in the courtyard, he only told her the essential, that he had been engaged to another woman. that she had abandoned him a week before the wedding, that since then he had built walls around his heart, high enough so no one could climb them. But over the following weeks, in nocturnal conversations that began to repeat like a silent ritual, the details emerged like flowers that slowly opened to the sun. Rebecca Hayes had been the daughter of a winemaker from Napa Valley, a young woman with bright dark eyes and contagious laughter, whom James met when he was nothing more than an economics student, with empty pockets and a head full of dreams. They met at a wine tasting room where she worked serving tables on weekends to help her family. "It was like lightning," he explained to Charlotte one night, while they both observed the stars from the house's belvedere. "I saw her cross the room with a tray full of wine glasses, dodging difficult customers and tourists, and I knew in that instant my life would never be the same." For 7 years, Rebecca and James built a dream together. She believed in him when no one else did, when his business ideas seemed far-fetched and his plans for the future sounded like a child's fantasies. She worked at his side as a secretary when he founded his first company, as an accountant when the business began to grow, as a silent partner when success finally arrived. "I gave her the ring the day we signed our first big contract," James continued, and his hand unconsciously sought the ring on his pinky. "We didn't have money for a diamond. It was a simple silver band I bought at an antique market, but she cried when I put it on her finger, as if I had given her the whole world." Charlotte listened in silence, absorbing every word, every detail, every inflection in her husband's voice. She was learning more about him in those nocturnal conversations than she had discovered in weeks of silent coexistence. "What happened?" she asked one night, when she finally dared to approach the most painful chapter of the story. James remained silent for a long moment. His face, illuminated by the flickering light of the candles he had lit in the courtyard, reflected a pain so deep Charlotte could almost touch it. "Success," he responded finally. "That's what happened." As the businesses grew, Rebecca began to change. Or perhaps, as James would admit later, she had always been that way and he simply hadn't wanted to see it. The luxurious life they began to lead overwhelmed her. The social events, the dinners with entrepreneurs and politicians, the expectations of behaving like the wife of a rising magnate, all of it made her feel like an imposter in her own life. "She never wanted this," James said, gesturing broadly at the mansion surrounding them. "She wanted a little house by the vineyards, children running barefoot through the grass, Sunday barbecues with her winemaker family. And I was so blinded chasing the next contract, the next expansion, the next million, that I didn't realize I was losing her." A week before the wedding, Rebecca disappeared. She left only a letter on the pillow of what would soon have been their marriage bed. "I didn't read it until the next day," James confessed. "When I came home and saw she was gone, I went out to look for her like a madman. I turned over every stone in San Francisco, Napa, Sonoma. It wasn't until I returned home, defeated and exhausted, that I found the letter." Rebecca's words still burned in James's memory, etched in fire after having read them hundreds of times. "I love you, James, but I can't continue living a life that isn't mine. I've met someone who offers me what I always wanted: simplicity, art, freedom. Forgive me for not being brave. But staying would have destroyed you too." I discovered later that she had left for New York with an artist she met at an art exhibition, James continued, and his voice was tinged with a bitterness Charlotte had never heard from him. "A painter with no name or fortune, but who promised her the bohemian life she had always dreamed of." Charlotte absorbed that story with a mixture of compassion and a strange sensation of relief that shamed her. Rebecca hadn't died, as she had come to fear. She had simply chosen another life, another path, another love. It was a betrayal, yes, but it was also a liberation. "Did you hate her?" Charlotte asked. James slowly shook his head. "I tried. During the first months, I tried with all my strength. But you can't hate someone for wanting to be happy, for not fitting into the mold you had prepared for her without consulting her. Rebecca didn't betray me out of malice. She left because staying would have destroyed her, and that, with time, I've come to understand." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "What I haven't been able to overcome is the fear. The absolute terror of allowing myself to feel again, to open my heart, to risk someone else deciding I'm not enough. that life with me is a prison they need to escape. Charlotte felt something break inside her hearing those words. For weeks she had judged James's coldness as arrogance, indifference, the contempt of a rich man toward an imposed wife. But now she understood that coldness was in reality a survival mechanism, an armor built piece by piece during 5 years of solitude, designed to protect a heart that had been shattered once and didn't believe it could survive a second blow. "James," she said softly, and for the first time since they'd known each other, she took his hand in hers. "I'm not Rebecca." He looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble. "I know," he responded, "and that's precisely what terrifies me." The 5th month of marriage brought with it a storm no one had foreseen, and that would forever change the dynamic between Charlotte and James. It began as a simple flu. Charlotte woke one morning with an irritated throat and slight discomfort she attributed to the change of season. Autumn had arrived in Northern California with persistent rain that turned the vineyards into oceans of mud and the roads into improvised rivers. "It's nothing," she insisted when Margaret suggested calling the doctor. "A little rest and I'll be fine." But 3 days later, the fever had reached alarming levels, and the cough had transformed into a deep roar that shook her entire body. The doctor who finally came to the mansion pronounced a diagnosis that made everyone present pale: pneumonia. "She needs constant care," explained Dr. Morrison, an older man who had attended to the Harrison family for decades. "Oxygen, intravenous medication, 24-hour monitoring. We could transfer her to the hospital in San Francisco, but honestly here she has better conditions and less risk of secondary infections." James, who had arrived from San Francisco as soon as he received the news, listened with his face petrified in a mask of barely contained terror. "I'll do whatever is necessary," he said in a hoarse voice. "Hire nurses, doctors, whatever she needs. Cost doesn't matter." The doctor nodded but added gently, "What she needs most, Mr. Harrison, is to feel accompanied. Loneliness is the worst enemy of the sick." It was then that something changed in James in a fundamental way. During the 3 weeks Charlotte's recovery lasted, he didn't leave her side except for the most basic necessities. He cancelled all his meetings, postponed all his business decisions, ignored all calls that weren't from the medical team. He installed himself in an armchair next to her bed, sleeping in fits, reading to her when the fever allowed her to listen, holding her hand when tremors shook her. Charlotte, in her feverish state, experienced those days as a kaleidoscope of fragmented images. She would open her eyes and find James's face bent over her, with an expression of concern so intense it seemed like physical pain. She would fall asleep and wake, and he was still there, like a guardian statue refusing to move from his post. "You need to rest," she whispered to him one night, when the fever had lowered enough to allow her to speak clearly. "You're going to get sick too." James shook his head, and his eyes shone with something Charlotte took time to identify: contained tears. "I can't leave you," he responded, and his voice broke on the last word. "I won't leave you." There was something more in those words, something that went beyond concern for a sick wife. It was terror Charlotte understood in a moment of lucidity. Absolute terror of losing someone again, of being alone again, of the person to whom he had begun to open his heart, without realizing it, deciding to abandon him as well. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised him, squeezing his hand with what little strength remained. "You haven't finished telling me your story yet." Those words drew a sad smile from James's lips. "There's much I haven't told you yet," he admitted. "Things I want you to know, things I only want to share with you." The nights of high fever were the worst. Charlotte tossed in turbulent dreams, murmuring fragments of sentences James tried to decipher without success. Sometimes she called for her mother, deceased when she was a teenager. Other times she spoke of her family's estate, of horses she had ridden as a child, of an older brother with whom she hadn't spoken in years. James discovered in those feverish deliriums fragments of Charlotte's life she had never told him. The early death of her mother, which had left her orphaned of affection in a house full of expectations. A distant father who saw her only as currency in the game of family alliances. A brother who had rejected her when she dared to question the archaic traditions of their lineage. "You're like me," James whispered to her one night while she slept a fitful sleep. "You're as alone as I am." And neither of us had admitted it until now. When the fever finally subsided and Charlotte began to recover her strength, something fundamental had changed between them. The invisible barrier that had separated them for months had cracked, revealing possibilities neither had anticipated. The first morning Charlotte could get out of bed without help, she found James asleep in the armchair, his neck at an angle that promised hours of pain when he woke. His face, usually tense even at rest, showed for the first time an expression of peace. The worry lines had softened, and a lock of dark hair fell over his forehead, giving him an almost youthful appearance. Charlotte observed him for long minutes, feeling a tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. This man had spent weeks caring for her, as if she were the most valuable thing in the world. He had sacrificed his work, his rest, his pride, just to make sure she was well. And at some point during those feverish nights, Charlotte had understood a truth that would change her forever. James was in love with her. Perhaps he didn't know it yet. Perhaps he fought against it with all his strength. But the love was there, evident in every gesture, in every look, in every word whispered in the dimness of the sick room. The question was, what did she feel for him? Charlotte's convalescence extended for 3 additional weeks, but they were weeks of unexpected sweetness that completely transformed the atmosphere of the mansion. For the first time since she'd married, Charlotte and James began to have breakfast together. They weren't silent meals like the dinners of the first months, but prolonged conversations that extended well into the morning. While the California sun flooded the dining room with its golden light, James spoke to her about his businesses, not with the condescending tone she had feared, but genuinely interested in her opinion. "There's a company in Silicon Valley that wants to partner with us," he commented one morning, while spreading orange marmalade on his toast. "They have revolutionary technology for sustainable wine production, but they lack capital and management experience." "And what do you think you'll do?" Charlotte asked, genuinely interested. I was hesitating. "The risk is considerable. But there's something you said once about preferring adventure to security that's been running through my mind." Charlotte smiled, surprised that he remembered those words, spoken almost in a whisper during one of their nights of conversation in the courtyard. "And what have you decided?" "That I want to ask you what you would do in my place." That simple question meant more than the words expressed. James wasn't just including her in his decisions, he was recognizing her as an equal, as a companion whose judgment he valued. The afternoons were spent in the library, where Charlotte recovered her strength reading while James worked on his laptop near her. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, but complicit. Every so often, their gazes would meet over books and screens, and small smiles were exchanged like shared secrets. One afternoon, Charlotte found the courage to address a subject that had been on her mind for days. "James," she said, lowering the book she had been pretending to read, "why did you never ask me about my family?" He raised his eyes from the laptop, his expression becoming cautious. "I thought you'd talk about it when you were ready. And if I told you, I'll never be ready. That there are things from my past I'd prefer to forget." James slowly closed the laptop and turned toward her with his full attention. "Then I'd tell you I understand perfectly, that we don't have to be defined by what others did to us, that the past only has the power we decide to give it." Charlotte felt tears gathering in her eyes. It was exactly what she needed to hear, though she wouldn't have known how to articulate it. "My father sold me," she said, and the words came out before she could stop them. "Literally. He negotiated my marriage to you as if I were breeding stock he was trading for money to save his estate. And the worst part is I let him, because I thought it was my duty. Because I'd been taught that the women in my family exist to serve the interests of the lineage." James got up from his seat and walked toward her, kneeling beside the armchair where Charlotte was reclining. "Listen to me carefully," he said, taking her hands in his. "What your father did was despicable, and what my family did, accepting that arrangement, wasn't much better. But that doesn't define you, it doesn't define us. What we do from here forward is all that matters." He paused, looking at Charlotte with an intensity that took her breath away. "And what are we going to do?" she asked, and her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and hope. James looked at her with an intensity that left her breathless. "We're going to build something new, something that's ours, not our family's, if you want." Charlotte nodded slowly, feeling an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. "I want," she whispered, "but I'm afraid." "Me too," he admitted. "But they say courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that there's something more important than fear." That night, as sunset tinted the sky in orange and purple tones, the sound of the cello floated through the mansion again. But this time Charlotte didn't listen from the shadows. She sat beside James in the courtyard, and when he finished playing, she began to sing an American folk song her mother had taught her before she died. Their voices intertwined in the melody, imperfect but sincere, filling the empty corners of that house that for too long had been a mausoleum of painful memories. And when the last note faded into the night air, James turned toward her with an expression she had never seen on him, one of pure and simple happiness. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for understanding, for giving me a second chance." Charlotte smiled, and for the first time in her life, she felt exactly where she should be. The discovery that would definitively change the course of their story occurred one rainy November afternoon when Charlotte was reorganizing the library. James had left for New York for a series of meetings he couldn't postpone, leaving her alone for the first time since her illness. Charlotte, who had completely recovered her strength, decided to use the time to explore corners of the mansion she didn't yet know. The library was a labyrinth of seemingly infinite shelves, with sections dedicated to all kinds of knowledge, from economics treatises to first editions of American classics, from antique maps to family photo albums. It was in one of these sections, hidden behind a burgundy velvet curtain, that Charlotte found the antique desk James used for his personal correspondence. She had no intention of snooping. She was simply looking for paper to write a letter to a cousin with whom she had maintained correspondence since childhood. But when she opened the second drawer of the desk, her eyes fell on something that left her paralyzed: a bundle of letters tied with a black satin ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was feminine, elegant, with a capital R that served as the sender: Rebecca. Charlotte knew she should close the drawer and walk away. Those letters didn't belong to her. They contained secrets from a past James had confided to her in words, but not with tangible proof. Reading them would be a violation of the trust they had built. And yet, her hands seemed to move of their own volition. Before she could stop herself, she had untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. "My dear James." The following 2 hours, Charlotte spent absorbed in Rebecca's correspondence. They weren't love letters, as she had expected, but something much more complex: the written testimony of a woman struggling to find her place in a world she didn't understand. Rebecca wrote about her fears, about the sensation of suffocation she felt at social events, about her terror of not living up to expectations. She wrote about her love for James, a love that hadn't diminished with time, but that wasn't enough to compensate for the unhappiness of a life she hadn't chosen. The last letter was different from the others. It was dated 2 years after her departure, and the tone had changed radically. "Dear James, I know you probably won't read this letter. I know you have every right to hate me for the way I left, without explanations, without goodbyes, like a coward fleeing in the night. But I need you to know something. I didn't leave you because I didn't love you. I left because loving you wasn't enough to be happy. And by staying, I would have dragged you into my unhappiness. I would have poisoned everything we built together. New York has given me what I always needed: simplicity, art, the freedom to be who I really am. David, my husband, loves me as I am, with my flaws and my fears. He doesn't ask me to be someone else. He doesn't ask me to be perfect. You deserved someone who could shine at your side, someone who wouldn't wither under the weight of the life you built. I hope you've found her, or that you'll find her soon. With all my eternal affection, Rebecca." Charlotte dropped the letter as if it burned. Tears ran down her cheeks without her attempting to stop them. She didn't cry from jealousy or rage, but from a deep compassion for all the protagonists of that story. For Rebecca, who had been brave enough to choose her own happiness, for James, who had been abandoned without truly understanding why, for herself, who now understood she wasn't a replacement, but a new opportunity. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting on the library floor, surrounded by letters. When the door opened and James appeared in the threshold, he had returned earlier than expected, and from the expression on his face, it was evident he understood exactly what she had been reading. The silence that settled between them was dense, charged with contradictory emotions. Charlotte expected anger, accusations, the return of the walls they had spent months demolishing. But instead James crossed the room with slow steps, sat on the floor beside her, and surrounded her with his arms. "Finally, someone else has read them," he said, and his voice sounded strangely relieved. "I've been carrying those words alone for years." "Aren't you angry?" Charlotte asked, astonished. "For discovering the truth?" "No, I'm relieved. Now there are no secrets between us. Now you know the worst part of my story, and you're still here." Charlotte pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "Rebecca wasn't a bad person," she said gently. "She was simply someone who didn't fit into the life you had built. That doesn't make you guilty, nor her a traitor. They were simply different people who wanted different things." James nodded slowly, and Charlotte saw how something relaxed in his expression, a tension he had carried for years. "You know what's most ironic?" he said. "I spent 5 years hating her for abandoning me. But reading those letters over and over, what I really hated was not having listened to her when she told me she was drowning. I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot to ask if she wanted to live in it." "And now?" Charlotte asked. "Will you ask me what I want?" James took her face in his hands with infinite delicacy. "I'll ask you every day," he promised, "and I'll listen to your answer, whatever it is." That night they conversed until dawn tinted the sky in pink tones. They spoke of Rebecca, of their fears, of their hopes, of everything they had kept hidden for fear of being judged. And when the sun rose over the vineyards, something new had been born between them. Not love yet, but the seed of something that could become true love. The following 2 months brought a fragile happiness that Charlotte savored cautiously, as if fearing it could vanish at any moment. She and James had found their own rhythm, a daily dance of small gestures and grand conversations. They had breakfast together, worked in the library, sharing the space with a comfort that before seemed impossible, dined exchanging ideas about all kinds of subjects. The cello nights in the courtyard had become rituals of silent intimacy, where words were superfluous and music said everything mouths couldn't express. But happiness, Charlotte had learned too young, always has a price. The first sign of storm arrived in the form of a phone call. James had gone out to answer it privately, something he hadn't done in weeks. And when he returned, his face had recovered the stone expression Charlotte believed she had defeated forever. "What's wrong?" she asked, feeling an inexplicable cold in her chest. "Nothing important," he responded, but his tone contradicted his words. "Business matters." That night, James didn't appear for dinner. Charlotte waited for him for hours, her stomach knotted with anxiety, until finally Margaret informed her that the master had left by car toward San Francisco without giving explanations. The following days were a repetition of the beginning of their marriage. James returned to disappearing before dawn and coming back after midnight. The polite notes reappeared on the breakfast table, cold and formal as at the beginning. When they crossed paths, he treated her with courtesy, but he had raised the walls she believed demolished. Charlotte tried to confront him, to demand explanations, but he avoided her with increasingly unconvincing excuses. Frustration gave way to anger, and anger to pain. "What's happening?" she shouted at him one night, when she managed to intercept him in the vestibule before he could escape to his office. "What have I done for you to treat me this way?" James stopped but didn't turn toward her. "You haven't done anything," he said, and his voice sounded exhausted. "This has nothing to do with you." "Everything that affects you affects me," Charlotte exclaimed. "We're married, James. We're supposed to face things together." He finally turned, and Charlotte saw something in his eyes that froze her to the bone. Fear. An absolute primitive fear she recognized because she had seen it before, during the nights of her illness. "I can't," he whispered. I can't drag you into this, I can't. He interrupted himself, shaking his head as if trying to chase away thoughts too painful to express. And before Charlotte could respond, he disappeared up the stairs, leaving her alone with the echo of his incomplete words. The truth arrived, as painful truths tend to arrive, in the most unexpected way. A week after the beginning of that inexplicable crisis, Charlotte received a visit from a woman she didn't expect to see again. Rebecca stood at the entrance of the mansion with a dark wool coat and an expression mixing nervousness and determination. The years had been kind to her. She had matured since the photographs Charlotte had seen, but her face retained the vivacity that must have enchanted James in that Napa wine tasting room. "Charlotte Harrison, I presume," Rebecca said, and her voice was softer than Charlotte had imagined. "We need to talk. It's about James." Time seemed to stop as the two women observed each other, like gladiators evaluating their opponent before a combat neither had sought. "Come in," Charlotte finally said, stepping aside. What Rebecca revealed to her in the next hour changed everything Charlotte believed she knew about her marriage. James hadn't been avoiding her out of rejection or a return of his old demons. He was facing a devastating business crisis. One of his main partners had committed fraud, leaving a financial hole of millions that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The investigation had also revealed that the fraud was connected to Charlotte's family, specifically to her father and brother, who had taken advantage of the marriage to infiltrate one of their men into James's company. "He didn't want you to know," Rebecca explained, "not because he distrusts you, but because he fears you'll choose your family over him. That when you discover your father used you not just for the marriage, but for this fraud, you'll decide it's too much and leave him." Charlotte felt the floor open beneath her feet. "How do you know all this?" she asked, trying to process the avalanche of information. "Because James called me," Rebecca admitted. 2 weeks ago. He didn't know who else to turn to. He needed advice from someone who knew him, who understood his way of thinking, and he thought I might. I don't know. Maybe help him find a solution. "And what did you tell him?" Rebecca looked at her with a mixture of sadness and admiration. "I told him to stop being an idiot, to tell you the truth, that the biggest mistake I made in my life was running away instead of facing my problems, and that if he repeated that mistake with you, he'd never forgive himself." Charlotte brought her hands to her face, struggling to contain tears. "My father," she whispered, "my own father used me as an instrument to steal from the man he married me to." "Your father is a despicable man," Rebecca said bluntly, "but you're not your father. And James needs you to prove it to him because he's too scared to believe it himself." The days following Rebecca's revelation were the darkest Charlotte had lived since her mother's death. She confronted James that same night, demanding the complete truth. He, defeated by the weight of a secret he could no longer maintain, gave it to her. The fraud amounted to more than $15 million. The corrupt partner, a man named Thomas Whitmore, turned out to be a distant cousin of Charlotte's, whom her father had strategically placed in James's company years before the marriage. The plan had been elaborated with surgical precision. The arranged marriage wasn't just to obtain the prestige of the Whitmore name, but to guarantee privileged access to the Harrison family's financial operations. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he offered your hand," James explained, his voice devoid of accusation, but charged with pain. "You weren't a price to save the estate. You were the Trojan horse that would allow infiltrating my company." Charlotte listened to those words, feeling something die inside her. All her life, she had tried to believe that her father, despite his coldness and rigidity, loved her in his way. That the arranged marriage was a necessary sacrifice, not a calculated betrayal. But the truth was brutally simple. She had never been more than a tool, a chess piece moved by hands that didn't belong to her. "What are you going to do?" she asked, and her voice sounded hollow, devoid of emotion. "What I should have done from the beginning," James responded. "Report Thomas and everyone involved, recover what I can of the stolen money, and pray it's not too late." "And us?" The question escaped Charlotte's lips before she could contain it. "What will happen to us when you report my family?" James looked at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. "That depends entirely on you, Charlotte. I'll never ask you to choose between your blood and me. I only ask that you don't hate me for what I have to do." Charlotte spent that night awake, walking through the mansion's hallways like a ghost. She stopped in front of the portrait of James's mother, a woman with kind eyes who seemed to observe her from beyond time. What would she have done in her place? What did loyalty mean when loyalties contradicted each other? At dawn, she made a decision. She dressed carefully, choosing a sober black suit that seemed appropriate for what she was about to do. She descended the stairs with firm steps, finding James in the dining room, as pale and hollow-eyed as herself. "I've decided," she announced, and her voice didn't tremble. "You have to report them. Thomas, my father, my brother, everyone who's involved." James looked at her with disbelief. "Are you sure? This will mean—" "I know what it means," Charlotte interrupted. "It means my family will repudiate me, that they'll drag my name through the mud, that they'll try to destroy me along with you. But I'd rather face that than be complicit with thieves, than continue being the piece they use for their games." She approached him and took his hands in hers. "My father sold me, James. I knew it from the beginning, but I refused to see the whole truth. He used me as currency, as a tool to rob you. That's not love, that's not family. And I refuse to protect those who treated me that way." James observed her with an intensity that pierced her like an arrow. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Charlotte smiled, and in that smile there was pain and determination in equal parts. "Because you showed me what it means to be treated with dignity. Because when I was sick, you didn't leave my side. Because when you discovered my family was betraying you, your first concern was how the truth would affect me." She paused, gathering courage to pronounce the next words. "And because I believe that at some point during these months, without realizing it, I began to feel something for you that I can't name, something worth protecting, even if it means losing everything else." James closed his eyes for a moment, as if Charlotte's words were too much to process. When he opened them again, they shone with contained tears. "Charlotte," he whispered, "You don't have to say anything," she interrupted. "Not now. Now we have a battle to fight. There'll be time for the rest." She was wrong about that, though she didn't know it yet. Time was a luxury they were about to lose. The following 3 months were a descent into hell. The report unleashed a media storm that exceeded Charlotte and James's worst nightmares. Sensationalist newspapers feasted on the story. The betrayed magnate, the wife of noble origin whose family turned out to be a band of swindlers, the arranged romance that ended up converted into scandal. Charlotte's family reacted exactly as she had predicted. Her father, from the estate that ironically remained standing thanks to James's money, issued a statement completely disassociating himself from his daughter. He accused her of traitor, of disloyal, of having sold her own blood for comfort. Her older brother, with whom she hadn't spoken in years, appeared on television denouncing her as an unscrupulous opportunist. "They knew perfectly well what they were doing," her brother repeated before the cameras. "My father and I are victims of a plot orchestrated by James Harrison to take our fortune. Charlotte is his accomplice, the bought wife who now bites the hand that fed her." The lies were so shameless they almost seemed true. Charlotte saw them spread through social media, through gossip shows, through the whispers of Boston high society that had once received her as one of their own. She didn't leave the mansion. Paparazzi camped in the surroundings, photographing any movement they could capture through the gates. The friends she thought she had disappeared one by one, fearful of being associated with the scandal. James, for his part, fought on multiple fronts. Meetings with lawyers succeeded without rest, preparing the case that would eventually bring Thomas and the other involved before justice. Banks, frightened by the news, threatened to withdraw credit lines. International partners demanded explanations he couldn't always give. "We're going to lose everything," he confided one night, when both lay exhausted on the salon sofa, too tired to climb to their rooms. "Not the money, that can be recovered, but reputation, trust, those things aren't easily rebuilt." Charlotte, who had spent the day reading articles describing her as a ruthless fortune hunter, found within herself a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed. "Do you remember what you told me the first night we really talked?" she asked. "You said you'd take it slow, that we had a whole life to get to know each other." James nodded, not understanding where she was going. "Well," Charlotte continued, "we'll take it slow with this too, step by step, day by day. We can't control what others say or think. We can only control how we respond." He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "How can you be so calm? Your family has publicly destroyed you. Your name is ruined." Charlotte shrugged with a serenity that surprised even herself. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm doing what's right. Not what I was ordered, not what was expected of me, not what was convenient. What's right. And that, James, is worth more than all the family names and all the fortunes in the world." That night, for the first time since the crisis began, James cried. They weren't tears of despair, but of relief, of gratitude, of something that was beginning to dangerously resemble love. And Charlotte, holding his hand in the darkness of the salon while the storm roared outside, understood she had found something she had never searched for, a companion, someone who didn't see her as an object or a transaction, but as a complete person, with strengths and weaknesses, with fears and courage, with a heart that beat at the same rhythm as his own. The battle was far from over, but they no longer faced it alone. The change arrived, as true changes tend to arrive, in the most unexpected way. 5 months after the scandal began, when the media storm had lost intensity but the wounds remained open, Charlotte received a letter she didn't expect. It didn't come from her family, with whom she hadn't exchanged a single word since the crisis began. It came from Rebecca. "Dear Charlotte, I know I have no right to write to you after bursting into your life the way I did, but there's something I need to tell you, something that might help you in this difficult time. Years ago, when I left James, I believed I was choosing freedom. And in a way it was. I found love, simplicity, the life I had always dreamed of. But for a long time, that happiness was stained by the guilt of having left him the way I did. What you've done, Charlotte, is something I never had the courage to do. Stay. Face the storm instead of running from it. Choose loyalty when it would have been easier to choose comfort. James was lucky to find you, and you, though you may not see it now, were lucky to find him. Don't waste that luck. Don't make the mistake I made. With sincere affection, Rebecca." Charlotte read that letter sitting in the courtyard, while the spring sun warmed her face and the scent of orange blossoms flooded the air. She had spent months feeling isolated, marked, as if she wore a scarlet letter engraved on her forehead. But Rebecca's words reminded her of something fundamental. She wasn't alone. She never had been. That same afternoon, she decided it was time to stop hiding. "I'm going out," she announced to James, who was working in his office with the concentration of one who had spent months fighting invisible enemies. He raised his eyes, worry marking lines on his forehead. "Are you sure?" "The journalists." "Let them photograph me," Charlotte responded with a defiant smile. "Let them write what they want. I've spent months locked up as if I were guilty of something, but I'm not. And it's time for the world to see it." James observed her for a long moment, and slowly, a smile began to form on his lips. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," she said, approaching to deposit a soft kiss on his forehead. "This is something I need to do alone, but I promise I'll return." "I know," he responded, and in his voice there was a confidence that months ago would have been unthinkable. "I'm no longer afraid that you won't." Charlotte spent that afternoon walking through the streets of San Francisco. She visited the Legion of Honor Museum, where she admired the sergeants James had recommended in those first notes that now seemed to belong to another life. She had coffee on a terrace near the Golden Gate, observing how the sunset tinted the water in golden tones. She walked through North Beach, losing herself in its labyrinthine streets as she had done as a child, when her mother was still alive, and the world seemed full of possibilities. The journalists found her, of course. They photographed her from afar, whispering among themselves speculations about what her public appearance meant. But Charlotte no longer paid them attention. She had spent too much time worrying about the opinions of strangers. It was time to start living for herself. When she returned to the mansion, She found James waiting for her in the vestibule with an expression mixing anxiety and hope. "How was it?" he asked. Charlotte smiled, and it was a luminous smile that transformed her entire face. "It was liberating," she responded. "I realized something important today. I've spent my whole life letting others define who I am. My father defined me as merchandise. My family defined me as a traitor. The newspapers define me as scandal. But none of them are right." "And who are you then?" James asked softly. Charlotte looked at him with an intensity that took his breath away. "I'm Charlotte, simply Charlotte, a woman who's learning to be brave, who has made mistakes and made difficult decisions, who has found, against all odds, a place where she feels safe." She took a step toward him, reducing the distance separating them. "And I'm the woman who loves you, James Harrison, not because it's my duty, not because I have no other choice, but because in the middle of all this chaos you've been my anchor, my home." The words remained suspended in the air like notes of a long-awaited melody. James looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if each facet of her face were a marvelous discovery. "I love you too," he whispered, and his voice broke with emotion. "I think I've loved you since that first night, when I promised to take it slow. I was just too scared to admit it." When their lips met, it was as if the outside world ceased to exist. There were no scandals or betrayals, no broken families or fortunes in danger. There were only two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not perfection, but acceptance. Not security, but shared courage. And in that kiss, long and sweet as a kept promise, their love story truly began. The months that followed were of reconstruction in every possible sense. The legal case advanced slowly but favorably. Thomas Whitmore and 3 other involved were prosecuted for fraud, and although Charlotte's father and brother managed to evade direct charges for lack of conclusive evidence, their reputation was destroyed. The family estate, ironically, ended up being auctioned to pay the debts the scandal had brought to light. Charlotte followed the news with a mixture of sadness and relief. She felt no satisfaction from her family's fall, but neither guilt for having provoked it. They had made their own choices. She had made hers. James, for his part, managed to save most of his business empire. He lost some important contracts, some partners who preferred to distance themselves from the scandal, but the core of his business survived. More importantly, he discovered that adversity had taught him lessons that success never could have. "Before I measured my worth in terms of numbers," he confided to Charlotte one night, while they both contemplated the sunset from the house's belvedere. "How many millions, how many contracts, how many employees? But now I understand that none of that matters if you don't have someone to share it with." Charlotte smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "And now? What measures your worth now?" "You," he responded simply. "Your smile when you wake up, the way you sing while you get ready for the day, the conversations we have when we think no one's listening, that's what matters. Everything else is accessory." The mansion, which for so long had been a museum of solitude, began to transform. Charlotte personally supervised the restoration of the closed rooms, returning light to spaces that had remained in gloom for years. The portraits were uncovered one by one, revealing generations of Harrisons who now seemed to observe with approval the changes occurring in their former home. Rebecca's cello was donated to a music conservatory in Napa Valley, along with a generous scholarship for students from winemaking families who wanted to study music. It was a way of honoring the past without remaining trapped in it. A particularly significant moment arrived when Charlotte decided to visit her family's estate before it was auctioned. James offered to accompany her, but she preferred to go alone. She needed to close that chapter of her life without witnesses. The estate was as she remembered it, the cobblestone courtyards where she had played as a child, the stables where she had learned to ride, the dusty library where her mother had read her stories before bed. She walked through each room, allowing herself to feel nostalgia without letting it overwhelm her. In her father's office, she found something she didn't expect, a framed photograph of her mother hidden at the back of a drawer. On the back, in the elegant handwriting Charlotte remembered from the letters her mother wrote when she traveled, there was an inscription: "For my little Charlotte. May you find the courage I never had. With all my love, Mom. Charlotte held that photograph against her chest, crying tears she had been holding for years. Her mother had known. She had known her daughter would grow up in a gilded cage, and she had left her a message of hope, hidden where only she could find it. When she returned to James's mansion, Charlotte carried the photograph in her hands, and a peace in her heart she hadn't felt in years. "Are you okay?" he asked, taking her coat as she entered the vestibule. "I'm better than okay," she responded, showing him the photograph. "I'm complete." That night, Charlotte placed her mother's portrait in a place of honor next to the portraits of the Harrison family. She was no longer an intruder in this house. She was part of it, and her mother, in some way, was too. The moment that would forever define their story arrived one spring morning, exactly 1 year after their wedding. Charlotte had woken feeling different, though she couldn't explain exactly why. She had dreamed of her mother, of Rebecca, of all the women who had somehow been part of her journey. In the dream, they all smiled, as if they knew something she hadn't yet discovered. James had left early to attend a meeting in Los Angeles, promising to return before sunset. Charlotte spent the morning in the library, trying to concentrate on a book that couldn't capture her attention. There was something in the air, an invisible electricity that kept her on edge. Mid-morning, the discomfort she had felt upon waking intensified. Dizziness, nausea, and inexplicable fatigue. She called Dr. Morrison, who came with his usual promptness. An hour later, Charlotte was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding in her hands a result that would change everything. She was pregnant. The emotions that traversed her were so many and so contradictory she could barely process them. Joy, of course, a luminous joy that seemed to radiate from the center of her being, but also fear. A deep fear rooted in everything she had lived through during the last year. Would she be a good mother? How would James receive the news? Were they ready to take this step after everything they had been through? She didn't have to wait long for answers. James returned earlier than expected, alarmed by a message from Margaret informing him the doctor had visited the house. "What's wrong?" he asked, entering the room with his face pale with worry. "Are you sick? Has the pneumonia returned?" Charlotte shook her head, unable to contain a smile struggling to form on her lips. "I'm not sick, James. We're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, tears of happiness so intense it overwhelmed her. James approached slowly, kneeling before her as he had done months ago, when he had promised they would build something new together. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he whispered, and his voice trembled. Charlotte took his hands and placed them on her belly, still flat, but already harboring a miracle. "We're going to be parents," she confirmed. "You and me. Together." The silence that followed was dense, charged with emotions words couldn't express. James looked at his hands resting on Charlotte's belly, as if contemplating something sacred, something he could barely comprehend. And then, for the first time since they'd known each other, James Alexander Harrison, the implacable magnate, the man who had built empires with his iron determination, completely collapsed. Tears burst from his eyes without restraint, and his body shook with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his being. They weren't tears of sadness, but of joy so intense it manifested as pain, as liberation, as the relief of years of solitude and fear finally overcome. "A child," he repeated again and again as if he needed to pronounce the words to believe them. "We're going to have a child. You and me. Together." Charlotte embraced him tightly, feeling her own tears mix with his. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. James raised his face, and his eyes, reddened but bright, looked at her with absolute honesty. "Terrified," he admitted. "But it's not the kind of fear that paralyzes you. It's the fear of wanting something so much you don't know how you'd survive if you lost it. The fear of loving so much you feel exposed, vulnerable, completely at the mercy of another human being." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was firm, despite the tears. "But I don't want to live protecting myself from pain anymore. I don't want walls or armor anymore. I want to feel everything, fear, joy, love, everything, with you, with our child." Charlotte smiled through her own tears. "Do you remember what you promised me the first night?" "To take it slow," he responded. "Well," she said, taking his face in her hands, "we'll take it slow with this too. We'll learn to be parents together. We'll make mistakes and correct them together. We'll celebrate victories and overcome defeats together, like we've done with everything else." James nodded, and in his eyes shone a light Charlotte had never seen in him, the light of someone who has finally found their place in the world. "I love you," he said, "more than I ever believed possible to love someone, and I'll love our child with the same intensity. I promise you." "I know," Charlotte responded, "because I know you, because I've seen who you really are, beyond the masks and defenses. And what I've seen, James, is an extraordinary man." They kissed then, a kiss that sealed promises and opened doors toward a future neither had imagined when they first met in that engagement party salon of arranged marriages. Outside, the spring sun bathed the vineyards in its golden light, and the scent of orange blossoms floated in the air like a blessing. The mansion that had been a museum of solitude was preparing to welcome new laughter, new footsteps, new stories. And Charlotte and James, embraced in the center of their room, knew that everything they had suffered, all the obstacles they had overcome, had been worth it to arrive at this moment. The moment when they stopped being two lonely people fighting against the world to become a family. 3 years later, the courtyard of Whitmore Estate resplendent under the string lights, serpentining between the vines and marble columns. It was the night of Charlotte and James's 3rd wedding anniversary celebration, but it was also much more than that. It was the night they would renew their vows. Charlotte contemplated herself in the same mirror where 3 years ago she had observed herself with fear and uncertainty. But the woman who now returned her gaze was completely different. Her eyes shone with confidence, earned through struggle, and on her lips danced a smile she didn't need to feign. She wore a white dress, simpler than the one from her first wedding, but infinitely more meaningful. She had chosen it herself, without designer advice or family impositions. It was a dress that spoke of second chances, of loves that bloom where least expected, of hopes that survive the most devastating storms. "Mommy, are you ready?" The little voice came from the door, and Charlotte turned to contemplate the image that provoked the most tenderness in the world, her daughter Emma, 2.5 years old, in a lace dress that made her look like a little California angel. Emma had inherited her father's dark eyes and her mother's black curls, but her smile was uniquely hers, radiant, mischievous, capable of melting the hardest heart. James often said this little girl had completed him in ways he hadn't known he was missing. "I'm ready, sweetheart," Charlotte responded, kneeling to embrace her daughter. "And you? Are you ready to carry the rings?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, showing the small velvet cushion where 2 new rings rested, the ones Charlotte and James would exchange that night, sealing a commitment that was no longer arranged or obligated, but deeply chosen. They descended the stairs together, mother and daughter, finding Margaret waiting for them in the vestibule with tears of emotion in her eyes. "You're beautiful," said the housekeeper, who in these years had become the adoptive grandmother Emma would never have. "The master is waiting for you in the courtyard." The courtyard was full of guests, but they weren't the aristocrats and magnates who had attended the first wedding. They were true friends, forged in the fire of adversity, workers from James's vineyards and their families, some of the partners who had remained loyal during the crisis, neighbors from the nearby town who had welcomed Charlotte when she most needed it. And in a discreet corner, with her artist husband and a smile mixing nostalgia and joy, was Rebecca. It had been Charlotte who invited her, recognizing that without her intervention at the crucial moment, they might never have made it this far. James waited by the Moorish fountain, in the same place where years ago he had played the cello under the moonlight, crying for a lost love. But the man who now contemplated Charlotte walking toward him was unrecognizable. His eyes shone with a happiness he no longer tried to hide, and when Emma ran toward him to be lifted in his arms, his laughter resonated through the entire courtyard like a long-awaited melody. "Hello, beautiful ones," he said, holding his daughter with one arm while extending his other hand toward Charlotte. "Hello, my love," she responded, intertwining her fingers with his. The officiant, an old friend of James who had witnessed their entire journey, began the ceremony with simple but meaningful words. "We are here to celebrate what these two people have built against all odds. Not a marriage of convenience, but a union forged in the fire of adversity. Not a contract between families, but a pact of love between two souls who found each other and decided to stay. Charlotte listened to those words, feeling each one resonate in the deepest part of her being. She remembered the night of her first wedding, the fear that paralyzed her, the certainty that her life had ended before beginning. And she compared that night with this one, surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, with her daughter in her husband's arms, with a future that no longer seemed like a condemnation but a gift. The moment for vows arrived. James spoke first, with a voice trembling with emotion. "Charlotte, 3 years ago I promised you I'd take it slow, that we'd have a whole life to get to know each other. But what I didn't know then was that knowing you would be the greatest privilege of my existence. Every day I discover something new in you, a strength that inspires me, a tenderness that disarms me, a love that makes me a better person." He paused, looking at Emma, who had fallen asleep in his arms, with the absolute confidence of one who knows herself completely safe. "You gave me a family," he continued. "Not just our daughter, but the experience of belonging, of having a home that's much more than walls and roofs. I promise to continue caring for that home every day of my life. I promise to continue taking it slow, learning, growing, loving you more with each dawn we share." Charlotte felt tears rolling down her cheeks without trying to contain them. When her turn came, her voice was firm despite the emotion. "James, I arrived at this house believing I was a prisoner, that my life had been decided by others, that my destiny was sealed in contracts I hadn't signed. But you taught me that cages only have the power we give them, that we can choose freedom even within the most limiting circumstances." She looked around, at the faces of those observing her with affection. "You taught me that family isn't just blood, that love isn't obligation, but choice, that the greatest treasures aren't inherited, but built. I promise to continue choosing you every day, in moments of light and in those of darkness, in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty. Not because it's my duty, but because there's no place in the world I'd rather be than by your side." The rings were exchanged, sliding onto fingers like symbols of promises kept and others yet to be kept. When the officiant declared them husband and wife again, the courtyard erupted in applause and cheers. But for Charlotte and James, the world had reduced to the three of them, father, mother, and daughter, united in an embrace that contained everything that mattered. Later, when the guests danced to the sound of a jazz quartet, Charlotte found a moment to escape to the library. She needed an instant of silence to process the magnitude of everything she felt. James found her there, contemplating her mother's portrait that now occupied a place of honor next to the Harrison ancestors. "Are you okay?" he asked, surrounding her with his arms from behind. "I'm perfect, Jackie," she responded, leaning back against his chest. "I just needed a moment to give thanks." "To whom?" Charlotte smiled, pointing at her mother's portrait. "To her, and to you, and to life, for proving to us that happy endings aren't just for fairy tales." James kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of jasmine he would always associate with her. "You know what I've been thinking," he said, "about everything I had to lose to find you. Rebecca, my trust, almost my company. And if you asked me if I'd do it again, if I'd go through all that pain again knowing what awaited me at the end." "Would you?" Charlotte asked, turning to look at him. Without hesitating a second, Honey responded, "Because at the end of the road there was you, and that, Charlotte, is worth any price." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, a soft kiss that contained all the gratitude, all the love, all the hope they had built together. "Let's go back to the party," she said when they separated. "Our daughter has probably woken up and is looking for her parents." "Our daughter," James repeated, and the word sounded like a prayer. "I still can't believe it, that we have a daughter, that we have a life, that we have this." "Well, believe it," Charlotte responded, taking his hand, "because this is real, you and me, Emma. This family we built from the ashes of everything we thought lost. It's real, James, and it's forever." They walked together toward the courtyard, where the music and laughter awaited them. Emma, indeed awake, ran between guests' legs, chasing a firefly that had entered, attracted by the lights. James lifted her in his arms, spinning her while she laughed with that crystalline laugh that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Charlotte observed them, feeling her heart was so full it threatened to overflow. The night continued with dances and toasts, with shared stories and promises of future meetings. But when the last guests finally left, and the mansion remained in silence, Charlotte and James found themselves alone in the courtyard, exactly where everything had begun to change years before. "Would you play for me?" she asked. Pointing at the cello now resting on a stand by the fountain, the new instrument that had replaced the one they donated. James smiled, taking the instrument with the familiarity of someone who has recovered a lost part of themselves. He began to play a soft melody, not the heartbreaking song of that first night, but something new, a composition he had created especially for her. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting herself be carried by the notes floating in the night air. The scent of orange blossoms mixed with the fresh breeze, and somewhere in the house, Emma slept peacefully in her crib, watched over by Margaret. When the melody ended, James set down the cello and approached her. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Charlotte asked. "For everything. For staying when you could have left. For loving me when I didn't deserve it. For giving me a family. For teaching me that taking it slow isn't cowardice, but wisdom." Charlotte smiled, taking his face in her hands as she had done so many times before, as she would do so many times in the future. "You don't have to thank me, James. This is what people who love each other do. They choose to stay. They choose to fight. They choose to build something beautiful even when the world tries to tear it down." They kissed under the California stars, surrounded by the murmur of the fountain and the scent of orange blossoms. It was a kiss that contained everything they had been, everything they were, everything they would be, and when they finally separated, walking together toward the house that was now truly a home, Charlotte knew with absolute certainty she had found what she had always been searching for without knowing it. A love that wasn't a cage, but a pair of wings. A love that didn't ask her to be less, but inspired her to be more. A love that had begun with 4 words whispered in the darkness of an arranged marriage night, and that had blossomed against all odds into something eternal. "I'll take it slow," he had promised, and he had kept his word, step by step, day by day, heartbeat by heartbeat, until building a paradise where before there had been only ashes.